Hi everyone, my name is Luca Corti from the University of Padua, and this is my video presentation for the workshop on teleology in Hegel's logic. Thanks first of all to Jim and Edgar for organizing this workshop despite the many obstacles due to the current situation. Sad that we cannot be all in Valencia, or at least we are all in Valencia, but only in spirit, while our bodies being in different parts of the world. But still it's cool that we can get to present our work and exchange idea with each other. So thanks, and thanks to all those who are watching this video. Thanks for your patience. I look forward to the discussion in a couple of weeks. So before starting, a few background remarks on my paper. As you can see from the title, I'm interested in the issue of the normativity of life, because this is part of a larger project which I just started, basically, which aims to inquire into the notion or into the relation between normativity and nature, starting from the assumption that normativity is not only a social matter, but rather that forms of normativity are constitutively involved in our way of thinking of some phenomena that we consider to be natural. So for this reason, I started looking, among other things, at what might be called Hegel's theory of natural normativity, guided by the idea that, again, there is some form of normativity which is the condition for the intelligibility of some natural phenomena, in particular, as you can imagine, as a condition for intelligibility of animal organisms, which are, to use for Hegel, to use a Sallartian expression, fraught with ought. So the general question I'm interested in is what kind of normativity is involved in the thinking of organisms. And today there are two kinds of answers that I will consider in this presentation, coming from two different family of accounts on norms or natural norms, which have been defended independently of Hegel, but they might be used and indeed they have been used to approach and interpret Hegel. One of the most renowned answers to this question comes from a group of accounts that have been called Neo-Aristotelian accounts, or Neo-Aristotelian naturalism, put forth by a series of famous philosophers in the past years, Thurston and especially Thompson, which I will consider in a second. This set of accounts turned around a particular notion, which is the notion of life form or species, and they mobilized a set of arguments to argue that the notion of life form or species plays a central role in thinking and judging of living individuals, and the notion of life form involves a normative dimension, which therefore is embedded in our very understanding of living beings. So their Neo-Aristotelian account is by now quite famous, and it offers powerful conceptual tools for grasping life at the logical level. But this is part of what I want to argue. There is a different way to approach normativity. There is a different family of views in the debate on normativity and teleology that go in a different direction and can play a role in understanding Hegel. They do not revolve around the notion of species as essential for understanding life, but rather on the notion of self-organization. And for this reason, they have been called organizational account. They've been developed in a different context, in the context of theoretical biology over the last 40 years, more or less, but they are nonetheless philosophically interesting for the kind of conceptuality they put in place and they have developed in thinking of organisms. According to this set of account, in general, it's self-organization that grounds our intelligibility of life, and in particular of organisms. And importantly, at least for me, for my research on normativity, it's the notion of self-organization that accounts for the teleology and the normativity of, excuse me, this is a typo, of no organic life. Still interesting is that in the last years there have been several attempts to reconstruct the history of the organizational account, so to construct a pedigree for the organizational theorist, and many scholars have argued that that this tradition originates with Kant, and there is a distinct kind of Kantian inspiration. Now, part of what I would like to claim is that this family of views is also useful to approach Hegel. It offers a viable alternative account for understanding Hegel's theory of odds in nature. Part of this has been also argued by some of the speakers in this workshop. And so I want to say the organizational account might enable us to recover some important Hegelian insights. Why I say that the organizational accounts offer an alternative take on Hegel with respect to the Aristotelian one? Well, because there is a certain tension between the two. In particular, as we will see in a second, some Neo-Aristotelian accounts, especially Michael Thompson's one, explicitly reject the notion of organization as a concept that is of any use in making life and organism intelligible. Now, given the presence of these two paradigms, the question that I think it's interesting to start answering, to restrict the scope of my talk, is not only the general how does Hegel conceive of organism and the normativity they exhibit, but the more particular question, what role does the notion of organization play in Hegel's account of living normativity, and what role does the notion of Gattung or species play in articulating Hegel's account? I will start, at least, inquiring into this question in my paper, and I'll do it as follows. The structure of the talk is the following. In part one, I will briefly present the Aristotelian views on norms and living individuals. Part two, briefly present the organizational accounts of norms or natural norms. And part three, I will explore Hegel's account in light of this distinction, showing how such a distinction can be brought to bear onto Hegel. And so I will try to isolate Hegel's paradigm for thinking of natural normativity. So for those of you who are already very familiar with Neo-Aristotelian account and with organizational account, so they can skip to part three of this talk. For the others, I hope that the first part are of some help in putting the cards on the table. With regard to Hegel's account, I will not have a final answer to give. As I said, this is very much a work in progress, but there are some points that I would like to make concerning Hegel's view on normativity and organisms. What are these points? Well, I will try to show that organization play a more fundamental role in Hegel's understanding of organism than most, and normativity, than most Neo-Aristotelians may be willing to admit. Easy point, I think, because Neo-Aristotelians think that organization plays no role in understanding normativity. I will try to show that the notion of organization is tied to a basic level of living normativity in Hegel, which is independent from the normativity that is tied to the notion of species. To do so, I will make reference to the organizational account, because I think the organizational account may be useful to unravel the Hegelian view and their potential in light of current conversation on norms. Okay, and then, I will say something about Hegel's theory of malfunction, and then finally raise some questions that are still open and I would like to discuss with you in the live Q&A session. Okay, part one, what are these Neo-Aristotelian account of what kind of view they provide of normativity in life? I will be brief because many people, I suppose, watching this video are already familiar with this kind of view. And I will focus in particular on Michael Thompson's account, which has been particularly influential for interpreting Hegel. What does Thompson say? Well, Thompson famously argues that our thoughts about living beings are different in kind from thoughts about non-living entities. He says like planets, etc. And he shows that judgment on living beings have a particular logical form. Thomson calls them famously natural historical judgment. Example of these judgments for him are bobcats breed in spring and the domestic cat have 4 legs. And he convincingly argues that this kind of judgment involve a kind of universality that cannot be understood in terms of standard quantification. So when we say the domestic cat has 4 legs, famously, we're not saying that all domestic cats have 4 legs. There are domestic cats which have less than 4 legs, for instance. When we are making this kind of judgment, we're not quantifying over a certain amount of individuals. This kind of judgment, Thomson says, involve reference to something like a life form, and reference to this life form involve normative consideration in terms of oughts. So what bobcats ought to do in a certain season, for instance, and they involve normative considerations regarding goodness and badness. So far, I think so good. This is like a brief, I hope not too distorted summary of Thomson. What is important, at least for me, is to focus on the idea that our very thinking of living individual is done in terms of species or life form. But also there is another more controversial aspect of Thomson's proposal that strikes me as not Hegelian, at least in spirit, because one step back. Of course, as you know, this kind of Thomsonian take on life has been used to interpret Hegel, in particular Hegel's notion of Gattung or species. Already Thomson suggested that the project of analytical Hegelism must be a form of analytical Aristotelianism, and then important scholars like Terry Pinkard, for instance, used Thomsonian insights to argue that for Hegel there can be goods and evils for plants and animals, and those reasons for plants and animals to respond in one way or another. So Pinkard even calls Hegel a defender of a disenchanted Aristotelian naturalism, and the same kind of consideration is done by Robert Pippin. So Thomson has been very influential in directing or inspiring certain views on Hegel. However, as I was saying, there are more controversial claims in Thomson, which I think are more difficult to square with Hegel, and might risk to obscure some important Hegelian insights on life and organism. The first one is Thomson's rejection of the notion of organization as a viable concept or notion for understanding life. Thomson thinks that organization is a completely empty concept, and if you remind, he uses a series of Anscombian arguments at the beginning of his book Life in Action, in a chapter titled Representation of Life, to say that, well, explanation of life in terms of organization at best make an unhappy metaphors. They are metaphors. So we say that things are organized or highly organized when we have no idea how to explain them, but that tells us something about us and our inability to explain things. He has this famous quote: "Is the administration of the University of Pittsburgh more highly organized than, say, a big or Hope Diamond, or more complex than the rule of chess?" So he ironically attacks any use of the notion of organization to explain life. And the same kind of argument is used to attack the notion of self-organization, self-maintenance, as self-reference in general, as a way for making life intelligible. Again, he thinks, for reasons that are analogous, with arguments that are analogous to those used for or against organization. He thinks that self-organization is an empty concept. This is a quote, and he attempted to mark the character of organism in general by and employment of such prefixes as self or auto, as in, say, self-reproduction, self-organization, auto-regulation, is for the same reason completely empty. And these are the two claims that I find most problematic in Neo-Aristotelian accounts such as Thompson's, and I would like to resist these two claims. And so what I would like to do is bring some evidence that shows that disposing of organization and self-reference in our thinking of life might be too quick, point number one, and it's not too Hegelian, point number two. To argue for the fact that, in fact, there might be an interesting way to account for the normativity of life in terms of organization, I will refer to the so-called organizational account. So, is there a way to account for the normativity of life in terms of organization? Thompson would say no. Definitely not. It's an unhappy metaphor. But the organizational accounts are those accounts that currently try to answer yes to that questions. Okay, what are organizational accounts? As I said before, group of accounts that have been developed in the field of theoretical biology, but nonetheless have some interesting conceptuality they have developed, which might be interesting also for interpreting Hegel. The core idea understanding organizational account is that organisms are self-maintaining systems whose basic properties can be described in terms as inherently related to self-determination. So very non-Thompsonian view, this one. Okay, here I will focus only on one version of the organizational account, which I think is one of the most refined ones and most influential ones, has been proposed by several scholars over the past 10 to 15 years in books like this one by Alvaro Moreno and Matteo Mossio, like Biological Autonomy, which my colleague and friend Andrea Gambarotto likes very much, and other set of papers published in various journals. I will say something about this publication later. So, what do organizational theories say? Well, they spell out the notion of self-determination in living system in terms of two basic properties. They call them organizational differentiation and organizational closure. What are these two notions? Well, organizational differentiation is the property of a certain system that consists in its being constituted by topologically different localizable structures or components. Some of these structures, they say, must be generated by the systems themselves. But there is a more fundamental distinction to be drawn in when we look at the organizational differentiation of a system, and it's between two basic aspects of a living system. Those are the aspects that organizational theories call processes and constraints. Let me introduce this terminology and this concept because I will use them later also in reading Hegel. What are processes? Well, according to their definition, processes refer to the whole set of changes, typically physical processes that occur in biological systems and involves the alteration, consumption, production, or constitution of relevant entities. And next to processes, when we look at living individuals, living organisms, for the organizational theorist, we see constraints. What are these constraints? Well, the constraints are entities which, while acting upon these processes, can be said from the appropriate viewpoint to remain unaffected by them. Constraints are not altered by, i.e. they're conserved through the process at the scale at which the latter takes place. The basic foundational example for these accounts are enzymes. Enzymes, as you know, act upon a particular process, a particular chemical reaction. They enable the chemical reaction to happen, but they are not themselves consumed in that kind of reaction. That, of course, does not exclude that on a longer time scale, enzymes might be involved in other reaction, might be the product of other chemical reactions, and so on. But at the relevant time scale, they don't affect the process they act upon as a constraint. Okay, so they specify the organizational accounters. They specify this as well. They say given theoretical entity cannot be qualified as a constraint per se, but only in relation to a specific process and relevant time scale at which the process occur. So it seems that, to simplify a little bit, but constraints are defined by the role that they play in this kind of process. And as some people have noticed, this involves no commitment regarding their ontological stages. So at the longer time scale, the constraints can be part of a further process as well. Okay, so once we have the notion of constraint and process on the table, we can understand the further properties, essential properties of organism according to the organizational account, which is called organizational closure, which is a notion defined in terms of the previous notions. Here I quote again, definition, what is organizational closure? The existence of each constraint depends on the existence of the others, as well as on the action that they exert on the dynamics of the processes. In this kind of situation, the set of constraints realizes self-determination as organizational closure. So the basic idea of the organizational account is when the constraints collectively contribute to the maintenance of the system, and each constraint depend on at least one other constraint. Well, then we have closure, or we have, as they say, a network of mutually depending constraints. In an article that came out quite recently in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, the model gets a little bit more formalized, and the author visualized this kind of relations between constraints and processes in this way. C2 is a constraint, it acts upon a process, A2, generating C1, which acts as a constraint on another process, and so on, unless there is another process that generates or enables C2 to be maintained. Okay. So we can talk about this model. There might be shortcomings, but basically this is its general structure. According to its proponents, the organizational accounts is explanatory in a wide range of phenomena. There is a kind of literature growing on the application, so to speak, of the organizational insights to biological explanation. But what I'm interested in is not this, but as I said at the beginning, is the notion of normativity that is involved in this kind of account, because proponents of this account, they think that it yields a new insight on normativity and functionality in organisms. Of course, normativity and functionality are interdependent, and according to this view, they are generated by closure. What does it mean that normativity and functionality are generated by closure? Well, let's start with functionality. The idea is that basically for something to have a function is to play the role of a constraint in a closed system, right? So closure is what grounds functionality within biological system. Constraints exert functions insofar as they are subject to closed organization. Here I have a more specific definition for what is a function according to the organizational view, but I will skip it. The general insight is that constraints subject to closure correspond to biological functions. So the proper function of something is the role that it plays within a closed network of constraints. Okay, we can talk more about this in the discussion. I hope we will talk more about this in the discussion. The important thing at this point is that this general paradigm also explains normativity. This is the article on synthesis in which authors try to explain teleology in terms of organization. I'm interested in these other parts, in this idea that the normativity that is connected to a functional attribution, what an item ought to do, depends on the force of the intuition that without that performance, the organizationally closed self-maintaining system would collapse. So in terms of normativity, what we have to learn, the lessons that we have to learn from this, the organizational account, is that closure is the circular causal regime that adequately grounds intrinsic teleology and consequently normativity, right? This is an interesting perspective, I think. It might have some shortcomings. I will discuss some of them in a second, but it's a contender on the current arena on natural normativity, accounts of natural normativity, and it's a contender that tries to make the notion of organization central. Okay. Well, the next question is, okay, but what the hell does it have to do with Hegel, right? I think it has to do with Hegel, because Hegel's accounts of organismal normativity might share many of the insights that I've just presented, right? So I'll try to defend this view and bring some evidence for this view, although it's not going to be conclusive. As a preliminary step, let me remind, other speakers will talk about this in this conference, that the organizational account has been linked with Kant recently. In the last year, there's been an important attempt by proponents of the organizational account to trace back the origins of the view in the history of philosophy. Part of this because they needed a pedigree for their insights. But this has brought a lot of attention onto Kant and has brought them to highlight the role of Kant as a sort of founding father and a key proponent for the conceptual elements at the core of the organizational account. But I think that this is also true for Hegel. So Hegel as well can be read in light of the organizational account, and in particular Hegel's theory of organizational normativity, natural normativity, can be read in light of the insight that I've just presented. So if you ask the question, is there room for self-organization in Hegel's account of natural normativity, I would like to reply yes. And this happens, I would like to reply yes, both at the level of the science of logic and the philosophy of nature. Hegel heavily relies on the notion of organization to account for at least some forms of normativity in organism. So how does he do? Let me say something about how Hegel might be seen to adopt a view in the context of his general account of the living individual, as you can see from this slide. Here we'll bring some textual elements from the science of logic and the lectures on the science of logic, the philosophy of nature, and the lectures on the philosophy of nature. The first thing to notice is that Hegel, when he talks about organism, living individuals, he adopts a processual ontology. So he says organisms are essentially processes. The organism is the infinite self-stimulating and self-sustaining process. even when he talks about the material parts of an organism, he often reminds his students and his readers that the existence of these parts is the process in itself. In his lectures, he says many times, these parts do not exist outside of the process. And so he underwrites processual ontology for organisms. But in the process, there is differentiation. Parts of the process have different roles. When Hegel looks at the internal differentiation of an organism, he distinguishes between two kinds of items. He calls them Mittel and material. You can find evidence in his lectures, for instance, Philosophy of Nature. The internal as means and as material. These means are the organs, the members, 1828. And his description includes the idea that parts of the systems, the material, are acted upon certain means. Okay, this distinction between parts, means and material, appears to Hegel to be a logical distinction. He says, in the sense of logic, is not one that pertains just to external reflection. So it belongs to the logical notion of organism. This kind of distinction, which we could understand as Hegel's theory of organizational differentiation, right? Then Hegel, when he speaks about organisms, says another thing that I find interesting. And he says there's these organs, which might be called these constraints, act upon certain material or processes. And they stay in a particular relation of dependence on each other, the organs, right, or constraints. It's a relation of mutual dependence. He says that in the Wissenschaft der Logik and in the lectures, and every time he talks about organism, he stresses this aspect. I've taken a quote again from the lectures, 1828 lectures on the philosophy of nature, where it's quite clear the kind of paradigm that he's adopting. He says, every organ secretes, and what is secreted is taken up from other organs. The other organs nourish themselves from the secretions. This is the very structure of like constraints and processes. Every organ is Zweck und Mittel. So is the life of an organ, is in itself this activity. Through this process, every organ is maintained as a member of the whole. Again, Hegel stresses that this is not just an empirical fact, but this mutual relation among organs that, in a way, creates the condition for the maintenance of the other organs, mutually creates this condition in a closed system, is an essential feature for the intelligibility of the notion of organism itself. So it belongs, so to speak, to the logical form of an organism. At the general level, he says that in the science of logic, in an organism, all members are reciprocally momentary means as much as momentary purposes. You can find this claim in various versions. Lectures on Logic, 1825. Every member is a means. The members are instant with itself. And then Lectures on Logic, 1817. Everything is means and purpose of the whole in an organism. So as you can see, the logical description is such that some parts enable some processes to occur, work on some material, and the processes in turn contribute to the maintenance of the parts. The parts metaphorically nourish themselves from the product of the processes in a closed network. And I think it's not incorrect to call this Hegel's theory of organizational closure. So after a theory of organizational differentiation between means and material, now we can see there is in Hegel something like a theory of organizational closure, a theory of relation among means and materials. The specific of this relational conception of organism are presented in the philosophy of nature. Hegel divides the organism in various closed subsystems. I will say something about this in a second, but I think the logical form of an organism appear quite clear also in the philosophy of nature. He says organic being is actual being, which is self-maintaining, which runs through the process in its own self. These parts bring forth the whole, whereas the parts bringing forth the whole does not mean creating or generating from nothing, but simply relate to each other in a way that is self-maintaining, or it's closed in a particular way. Okay, what is interesting for me, again, I'm still doing a project on normativity. What is interesting for me is that if we can identify such a paradigm in Hegel, then a Hegelian idea of functionality and normativity in the spirit of the organizational account comes into view. So remind that, according to the organizational account, closure generates a criterion for determining what norms the system is supposed to follow. The system must behave in a specific way, otherwise it would cease to exist. And so the insight is that, let me restate it in a different way maybe, that since a certain performance is essential to the self-maintenance of the system, without the presence of such performance the system will collapse, then this enables us to identify such a performance as the proper function of a certain element or what the element ought to do, so normativity. So if there is something like this insight in Hegel, if there is something like this conception of organism in Hegel, then Hegel might be seen as having an account of normativity that does not involve reference to the notion of species or Gattung, which is in fact addressed in a later separate stage. But there is a form of normativity that is tied to organization, a form of normativity that for some scholars and some Hegelians might still be too mechanical. I hope we can talk about this in the discussion, but it seems to me that it can be seen as logically independent from the kind of normativity that comes into view when we appeal to the notion of species or Gattung. It's a different kind of normativity, organizational normativity. Okay, here is where things might become interesting. If we grant that Hegel might draw on this account of normativity, organizational normativity, well, the next question one might ask is okay, but what kind of phenomena can this organizational attribution of normativity capture, and what can it not? The organizational account, in fact, as many of you know, has limits, or at least has problems that have emerged in the current conversation on norms, problems that basically regard its explanatory scope, the kind of things one can account for in terms of organization, and the kind of norms one can account for in terms of organization. And so I think exploring this question might help us to identify Hegel's answer and show to what extent he relies on the notion of organization, how pervasive that notion is, and also see where he stops using organizational paradigms and then refers to the notion of Gattung or species. Okay, what are these problems? I will mention 3 of them and then see how Hegel reacts to them. The first one regards the restricted scope of normative functional attribution in an organizational perspective. Well, because if we define the normativity and functionality of an item in terms of closure, well, this problematically restricts the kind of things that can have an ought. and that can be seen as ought to work in a certain manner. Think about, for instance, parts that are not involved in regimes of closure. For instance, parts of organisms such as ears or eyes, right? I mean, some people have objected to the organizational accounts that, well, my body will survive without ears. They are not necessary for self-maintenance. They're not caught up in a regime of closure. So, according to the organizational account, it's difficult to see how we can attribute to them functions. If ears are not essential to self-maintenance, according to the account, they have no function, but we think that we do. And so how can we accommodate this insight? Also in light of the fact that, of course, my body would keep maintaining my ears even if they stopped performing their activity, for instance, in deaf people. So it seems that this attribution of oughts to parts that are not involved in closure might require some additional conceptual resources. The question is then, should we not rely on the good old Aristotelian notion of species to account for the presence of such parts and for the normativity involved in our judging about these parts? Question number 1. Problem number 2 regards the so-called cross-generational traits. Traits like bee stingers, sorry for the typo, or sperm or millicent. So stingers, as you can see, like they seem to have a function, but they do not contribute to their own persistence as tokens within the same individual, and the same considerations apply to sperm. So how can we account for the normativity of these elements in an organizational perspective where they do not seem to be caught up in any form of organizational closure? So these items. Should we embrace a so-called splitting account, saying that there are some parts of the organism that can be explained organizationally and some other parts that require a different account for their normativity? Maybe this different account, again, should it be spelled out in terms of the good old notion of Aristotelian species? Of course, the standard organizational account rejects this move, but it seems to be open to Hegel. Third problem that I want to mention is the problem of malfunctioning. It seems that if we adopt an organizational perspective, then we have a difficulty to distinguish between malfunctioning and not having a function, between something that doesn't function well and something that doesn't function at all. Why? Well, because if an item stops performing its activity, it seems that one should, and so the regime of closure collapse. One should, strictly speaking, say that that item does not have any function anymore, not that it is malfunctioning or malfunctional. This is another problem facing the organizational accounts, and here again one might think, yes, but maybe we can solve this using further conceptual resources. Maybe we should bring a notion of species into the picture. So you can see that facing all these problem, the organizational account might have some problems, and you could see, like, Aristotle's notion of species coming to the fore. So Aristotle smiling into the back and saying, well, in the end, you have to use my notion of species to understand the normativity of some phenomenon, some parts of organisms, some aspects of organism. What strikes me as noteworthy, however, is that Hegel, in addressing this problem, does not call on a notion of species, but still relies on the notion of organization, or at least still relies on a view that puts organization at its core and the normativity it involves. Takes, for example, the problem of malfunctioning and Hegel's account of malfunctioning. In Hegel's account of malfunctioning, a central role is played by the idea that organism is a system of systems, so is a system of closed system. And in Hegel perspective, it is, so malfunction is a failure of one of these subsystems to contribute to the general closure of the system. So it's one of these subsystems that can be said to be malfunctioning, when it operates in a way that fails to contribute to the general maintenance of the system. This is Hegel's famous definition of disease, where malfunctioning comes to the fore. The organism is diseased, in a diseased state, when one of its systems establishes itself in isolation, and by persisting in its particular activity, in opposition to the activity of the whole, obstructs the fluidity of this activity as well as the process by which it pervades all the moments of the whole. So I think it's possible to read this passage in a way in which the notion of species does not play any role. It seems that for Hegel, malfunctioning is understood in terms of the activity of a particular sub-regime of closure, let's call it like this, subsystem, closed subsystem, which operates in a way that the general and global self-maintenance of the system is hindered, there is an obstacle, right? Or, as Hegel himself to say, malfunctioning alters the succession of function, the closed regime of dependence among constraints. Okay. I don't know, whatever the advantages of this view are in solving the issue of malfunctioning, it seems that Hegel's approach to malfunctioning, at least at this level, needs to be differentiated from an Aristotelian account of defectiveness, which is tied to a particular notion of Gattung. In fact, Hegel's definition of malfunctioning, also in the paragraphs regarding sickness, do not call on the notion of species, but rather centers on the contribution of a particular system to the general self-maintenance of the organism. Okay. And another interesting thing regarding the centrality of the notion of organization regards another notion that Hegel brings into the picture to explain some of the problems that I have mentioned before. Because when, as a part of his definition of the right functional dimension of an organism, Hegel introduces the notion of the universal type of the animal, which I think is extremely interesting. It comes from Cuvier, and it is the standard against which to normatively assess various forms of animality and organization in nature. This is the notion that responds to the problem of parts that are not caught up in closed regimes. In the text, Hegel says, in many animals there are rudiments of organs which belong only to the universal type, philosophy of nature. That means that parts that are not caught up in closed system, they are rudiments, but their normativity and functionality should be assessed in terms of their relation to the universal type. But the type, however, is defined again, seems to me at least, in terms of a particular kind of organization. This is what Hegel says about the type in his definition. The universal type of the animal determined by the notion lies at the basis of the various forms and orders of animals. This type is exhibited by nature partially in the various stages of its development, from the simplest organization to the most perfect. It's a part that I have put in bold and highlighted because I think it's important. The universal type of the animal is defined in terms of organization, so the notion of organization appears to be basic, to the point that the concept of universal type of the animal for Hegel, as you remember in this paragraph, for Hegel should guide the inquiry of the natural scientist as well. But the notion of universal type is defined in terms of organization. So it seems to me that all this speaks in favor of a presence of a ground level of normativity in animals, animal organisms at least, that is embedded in the concept of living individual as realizing a particular form of organization or self-organization. And I hope, I will close now because I've already talked too much, that I've showed that this central for Hegel, more than maybe the Neo-Aristotelians might be willing to admit. And then I hope to have showed also that reference to the organizational accounts, contemporary organizational accounts, can be of help in understanding how organization can be seen not as an empty concept, as Thompson thinks it is, but as a viable way of addressing organism. Of course, this opens for the questions that I haven't fully explored yet. I hope I will take advantage of the discussion to talk about this more with the audience. And the central question then remains open for me, and on which I plan to work, and I'm working at the moment, is, well, given this view, once we can refine the view that I've just sketched on the organizational account of normativity, then what is the role of Gattung in our account, in the Hegelian account of living normativity? And this is a difficult question. Of course, as you know, Gattung is responsible not for the self-maintenance, so not the notion that explains self-maintenance, but the generation of new individuals that are of the same in kind. And so, as Hegel says, the propagation of the living species, but also Hegel's definition of Gattung accounts in a way for the death of the individuals, and Gattung involves a particular kind of relation between universality and particularity. So there is a lot built into this notion. From the point of view of a theory of natural normativity, is certainly true that, well, Gattung explains cross-generational traits in one sense or the other, and also that Gattung enables some considerations in terms of defectiveness here. I've learned a lot from Jim's book and Jim's articles, in which he claims that in case of life, the possibility of defect or malfunction is relative to the rule, the characteristic, or the species or class. But again, what I think what I've said so far is compatible with this view, but also supports the idea that defect of malfunctioning, or at least some form of defect or malfunctioning, can be accounted for only in terms of organization. So already at the level of self-organization, and this level is logically distinct from the level of Gattung. This is another problem that I have with the notion of Gattung. It seems that Hegel sometimes doesn't put a lot of weight into the notion of species, as he does with the notion of organization. As in the beginning of The Sense of Logic, he says, one can find a determination according to which animal in general is divided into mammal, bird, etc., etc. Such determination are taken from elsewhere, from empirical intuition. So it's difficult to understand what kind of role the notion of species play if Hegel himself says that the content of the species is taken from empirical intuition. So seems to deflate the notion of species in a way that it doesn't deflate the notion of organization. But those are the open questions, so it will be the next step of the research and of the work, once that the account of organization is defined in a more substantial way, and the account of organizational normativity is defined in a more substantial way, then one might integrate it with the notion of species normativity. So far, however, I have different, more humble conclusions than drawing a general picture of Hegel's notion of natural normativity, and the conclusions are the following. Regarding the question of Hegel and the normativity of an animal organism, I hope to have shown that the notion of organization plays a basic role in determining Hegel's account of normativity in organisms, more than Neo-Aristotelians might be willing to admit. And thanks to the organizational accounts, or by using some insights from the organizational accounts, it seems to me that the notion of organization and the notion of species and the two kind of insights they offer onto the normativity of living beings, if not separable, they're at least distinguishable. So organization is distinguishable from the notion of species. And that there is a level in which Hegel's theory of normativity would not need to rely on a Neo-Aristotelian conception of an organism, nature, or species to enable normative judgment. So organization accounts for some odds that in a Neo-Aristotelian account are understood in terms of species. I have made the example of malfunction. And I hope that I've shown how reference to current organizational accounts might help us to uncover some aspect of the logic and philosophy of nature that have value for current discussion. Is there a further point? Yes. Yes, of course, like the general direction that this first, like the general direction that the work on Hegelian theory of natural normativity, my work might take after this paper is to rethink the division of labor between the Neo-Aristotelian notion of Gattung and the principle of organization within Hegel's theory, and rethinking in a way that takes into account the role of organization in Hegel's theory of natural normativity. As I said, the full reconstruction of Hegel's theory of natural normativity at the logical level and the level of the philosophy of nature must combine these two elements, but this is behind the scope of my paper. This is a very preliminary step in my research on animal organism, and I look forward to discussing the details with you. Okay, thanks for your attention.